After my husband's funeral, my son-in-law smiled at me across the reception table and said the words that would define the rest of my life. Now that Walter's finally out of the picture, the foundation is going to need a real chairman, someone who actually understands the modern nonprofit world. I just nodded and thanked him for his condolences. But 3 weeks later, when my accountant walked into that boardroom and read the forensic audit out loud, his entire carefully built world came crashing down around him. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments which state you're tuning in from tonight. And if you've ever had family try to take advantage of you during your darkest hour, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this. My name is Eleanor. I'm 68 years old, and for nearly 40 years, my husband Walter and I ran a charitable foundation out of a converted farmhouse in central Pennsylvania. It started small. We'd both grown up poor, the kind of poor where you learn to stretch a single chicken across 4 dinners, and we swore that if we ever had 2 nickels to rub together, we'd spend our lives making sure other people didn't have to know that particular kind of hunger. Walter was a civil engineer by trade, brilliant with numbers and bridges and anything that needed to be built to last. I taught 3rd grade for 22 years before I stepped away to run the foundation full-time. Between his engineering consulting fees and the careful, patient work of grant writing and donor relationships, we built something real. The Hartwell Family Foundation started by funding school lunch programs in 3 rural counties. By the time Walter got sick, we were operating in 11 states, funding literacy programs, food banks, and scholarship funds for kids who reminded me of the students I used to teach. We were never flashy people. Walter drove the same pickup truck for 18 years. I still clip coupons out of habit, even though we didn't need to anymore. But wealth never changed who we were at our core. We measured our worth by the meals we funded, not the cars in our driveway. Life was good, genuinely good, until the stroke took Walter almost overnight. One moment, he was reviewing grant applications at the kitchen table, complaining about his coffee going cold, and the next he'd collapsed onto the hardwood floor. The hospital called it a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He held on for 11 days in the ICU before his body simply gave out. I sat beside that hospital bed every single one of those 11 days, holding his hand, telling him about the applications that had come in, promising him the foundation would be fine, that I would take care of everything. I stepped back from the daily operations during those weeks to be by his side, and I trusted my son-in-law, Marcus, to keep things running smoothly in my absence. I thought I had gained a partner when my daughter married him. I was wrong about that in ways I couldn't have imagined. My daughter, Vanessa, is 41 years old, and somewhere over the last decade, she stopped making her own decisions entirely. She let Marcus handle everything, from the family finances to which schools their children attended to, eventually, the direction of a foundation her own father had built from nothing. Marcus is 44, sharp-suited, always talking about scaling impact and strategic partnerships in a voice that made everything sound like a corporate merger instead of a mission to feed hungry kids. When Walter and I stepped back during the illness, Marcus eagerly volunteered to handle the foundation's operations. He had an MBA and had spent a few years in private equity before what he called pivoting to purpose-driven work. I thought it would be temporary, a favor between family while we focused on Walter's health. But Marcus settled into Walter's office chair like he'd been waiting for it his entire life. Whenever Marcus and Vanessa visited the hospital, there was a strange coldness to it, like they were fulfilling an obligation rather than sitting with family. Marcus would glance at his phone constantly, sighing when the monitors beeped too long, checking his watch as if Walter's dying was inconveniently cutting into his afternoon schedule. He started slipping in comments disguised as helpful advice. Eleanor, the funding landscape has changed so much. Donors want metrics now, dashboards, impact reports. You and Walter built something wonderful, but it's a little old-fashioned for where philanthropy is headed. Let me modernize things while you focus on him. My daughter never pushed back. She'd stand there, twisting her wedding ring, looking anywhere but at me. Why did she stay so silent? Because Marcus had found his leverage. Our 2 grandchildren, Sophie and Miles, ages 9 and 6, were the light of my entire world, the only thing that made those hospital hallways bearable. Marcus knew exactly how much I loved those children, and whenever I tried to gently push back on his plans, he'd mention offhandedly how busy their schedules were getting, how maybe grandma visits needed to be more structured going forward. He was rationing my own grandchildren to keep me compliant, and it was working. Things came to a head during Walter's final days in the ICU. The hospital's palliative care team recommended a private room transfer, one with better comfort measures for what they gently called his transition. It wasn't fully covered by our insurance, and the difference came to almost $4,000 for the remaining time he had left. Money should never have been a question. I had spent 4 decades building an organization that moved millions of dollars toward good causes every single year. I called the foundation's business manager and requested a routine transfer from our personal reserve account, money that was unquestionably mine and Walter's to use. Marcus intercepted that request within the hour. He showed up at the hospital, pulled me into the family waiting room, and closed the door behind him. "Eleanor," he said, his voice syrupy and careful, "I really wish you'd run this by me first. We're in the middle of a sensitive donor cycle right now, and pulling from reserves sends the wrong signal if it ever came up in an audit. Optics matter enormously in this space. You understand, right? We have to think about the foundation's reputation." He was denying me the money to make my husband's final days more comfortable, dressed up in the language of nonprofit governance. And that was when I noticed it. A brand new leather briefcase resting against his chair, the kind that ran close to $2,000. Purchased, I would later learn, with the foundation's discretionary card. He had looked me dead in the eye and lectured me about optics while carrying $2,000 of stolen goodwill on his shoulder. I felt something white-hot rise in my chest, a rage I hadn't experienced since I was a young mother watching a bully torment one of my students. I wanted to scream at him right there in that sterile waiting room. I wanted to call security and have him removed from the hospital entirely. But then I thought of Walter. 11 days into a fight he was quietly losing, and I knew that any chaos, any raised voices, would only make his final hours harder. So I did what I have always done when the world tried to provoke me into losing my dignity. I swallowed it whole. I paid the difference out of my own personal checking account, the one with the modest balance I'd kept separate out of some old habit from teaching days, and I said nothing more to Marcus. I chose peace, for Walter's sake, one more time. But as I watched Marcus walk back down that hospital corridor, adjusting his tie with the satisfied look of a man who believed he'd won a negotiation, I understood something with total clarity. He thought my silence was surrender. He looked at a grieving woman in a cardigan and saw someone too tired and too heartbroken to ever fight back. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. The hospital room had gone quiet in that particular way that only happens in the final hours. It was just past 3 in the morning when the machines began their slow, terrible countdown. I sat in the vinyl recliner they'd pulled up beside his bed, holding Walter's hand in both of mine, the way I had held it on our wedding day 41 years earlier. The cancer or the stroke, whichever cruel thing was finishing its work, had stolen his ability to speak days ago, but it never touched the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me. I leaned close and whispered to him about the early days, about the drafty farmhouse we bought with nothing, about the winter we couldn't afford proper heat, so we slept in the same bed, bundled in every blanket we owned, just to stay warm and laughing about it anyway. I wanted his mind, wherever it was, to be filled with the good years before he had to let go. His fingers tightened around mine one final time, the faintest pressure, and then slowly, over the space of a few unbearable minutes, his breathing grew shallow and then stopped altogether. I did not cry out. I simply rested my forehead against his hand and let the tears fall in silence. For hours I sat there, hollowed out, unable to move, unable to think of anything beyond the fact that the other half of my entire life was gone. When the sun began to rise through the hospital blinds, I knew I had to make the calls that no one ever wants to make. I phoned my daughter first. Vanessa answered, groggy and confused. And when I told her, she began to cry softly into the phone, promising they'd come right away. I sat back down beside Walter's body to wait. It took nearly 40 minutes for them to arrive. And when the door finally opened, I expected to see my daughter rush in, grief-stricken, needing to say goodbye to the father who'd walked her down the aisle. Instead, I heard the crisp, purposeful click of dress shoes against hospital tile. Marcus walked in first, wearing a full suit at 6 in the morning, freshly shaved, looking like he was headed into a board meeting rather than his father-in-law's deathbed. Vanessa trailed behind him, pale and lost, clutching a tissue, but Marcus moved through the room like he was assessing square footage. He didn't approach the bed, he didn't take my hand or offer a single word of comfort. He stood a few feet back, scrolling through something on his phone. "So it's done then," he said, his voice completely flat, like he was confirming a delivery had arrived on schedule. I kept my eyes on Walter, gently smoothing his hair the way I had 1,000 mornings before. Vanessa stood near the door weeping quietly, but she made no move toward her own father's body. "We should notify the board this morning," Marcus continued, already tapping something into his phone. "I'll draft the transition announcement myself, and I want to schedule an emergency meeting with the full board by end of week to formalize the interim leadership structure. It'll look better to donors if we move quickly and decisively rather than looking rudderless." I slowly turned to look at him. My husband had been gone for less than 2 hours. His body was still warm in that bed, and my son-in-law was already restructuring an organization Walter had spent his life building, as though grief were an inefficiency to be optimized away. There was no sorrow anywhere in Marcus's face, only a cold, practiced calculation. "Eleanor," he said, looking down at me the way you might look at an elderly relative you were being patient with, "I know this is hard, but the foundation can't afford to stall. We have grant deadlines, we have a gala in 6 weeks, we have a responsibility to the communities we serve. I've already reached out to a few board members informally. I think it's time we discussed a permanent leadership transition. Given everything on my plate managing operations these past months, I think I'm the natural choice for interim executive chairman." The words hung in the sterile hospital air. My husband, the architect of everything this man was so casually claiming, was nothing more than a vacancy to be filled. Vanessa sniffled and wiped her nose. "Marcus is right, Mom," she murmured, barely audible. "Dad would have wanted the foundation to keep helping people. We can't let it stall." I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had rocked to sleep in that same drafty farmhouse, and heard her repeating the cold arithmetic of a man who saw grief only as a scheduling obstacle. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed another tear in front of either of them. I stood, kissed my husband's forehead one final time, and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "Send the meeting invite," I told him, my voice steady, giving nothing away. "We'll handle the transition exactly the way it needs to be handled." Marcus's mouth curved into a small, satisfied smile. He believed in that moment that he had already won. He turned and began murmuring logistics to Vanessa as they walked toward the elevator. I stood alone in that hospital room and made a silent promise to my husband. I would let Marcus believe he had built his perfect plan. I would let him step into that office chair and feel the weight of a throne beneath him. And then I was going to take it all away from him, piece by careful piece. The funeral reception was held at the farmhouse, the same one Walter and I had bought with nothing 40 years earlier, now filled with the smell of lilies and casseroles instead of the wood smoke and coffee I associated with the place. Board members, longtime donors, program directors from 3 different states, all of them crowded into rooms that used to just hold Walter and me and a mountain of grant paperwork. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, murmuring thank yous, feeling entirely detached from my own body. I watched Marcus hold court in the living room, his hand resting a little too proudly on the doorframe of Walter's old study, as though he were already the master of the house. He wore a black suit that looked tailored for a magazine spread rather than a memorial. He told our largest donor, a retired pharmaceutical executive named Harold Blevins, how devastated he was, how Walter had been like a father to him, his voice cracking with practiced emotion at exactly the right moment. None of them knew that 3 weeks earlier, this same grieving son-in-law had denied his dying father-in-law's comfort care over optics. None of them knew he'd been drafting a leadership announcement before the body had even left the death. Hospital room. Marcus pulled my grandson Miles close against his side, resting a hand on the boy's small shoulder as he told Harold Blevins that the foundation's future was secure, that the family bloodline would continue Walter's legacy under steady, capable leadership. He was using a 6-year-old as a prop to reassure a room full of donors that nothing had really changed, that the money would keep flowing exactly where he wanted it to flow. I searched the room for Vanessa and found her standing near the fireplace, quiet, diminished, glancing at Marcus every few seconds like she was checking for permission before she spoke to anyone. She had once run the fundraising gala's silent auction with total confidence, joking with donors, charming everyone in the room. Now she was a shadow standing at the edge of her own father's memorial. I thought about the early galas we used to throw in this very living room, back when we had maybe 15 guests and served potluck casseroles on paper plates because we couldn't afford a caterer. We knew every single family we helped by name back then. Now the room was full of consultants and board members eating catered hors d'oeuvres off silver trays, and Marcus was working the crowd like it was a fundraiser for himself. I realized, standing there with a lukewarm cup of coffee going cold in my hand, that he had been quietly building relationships with our board and our biggest donors for months, positioning himself, using Walter's illness and now his death as the perfect cover to consolidate control before anyone thought to question it. The noise of the reception began pressing against my temples. The clinking glasses, the low murmur of condolences, the performance of it all. I needed 5 minutes of silence. I slipped away from the crowd and made my way down the narrow hallway toward Walter's study, the one room in the house Marcus never seemed to enter, put off by the smell of old paper and the clutter of 4 decades of foundation records. I walked softly, avoiding the third floorboard from the end that had creaked for as long as I could remember, out of pure habit rather than any real intention to hide. I did not know that this simple need for quiet was about to change everything. The hallway leading past the kitchen carried voices I recognized instantly, and something in the tone stopped me cold before I could turn the corner. It was Marcus, but stripped of the warm, grieving voice he'd been performing for Harold Blevins just minutes earlier. There was only irritation now, sharp and businesslike. I pressed my back against the wall, hidden in the shadow of the hallway, and I listened. Marcus was telling Vanessa to stop looking so miserable that they finally had a clear runway, and she was acting like the whole thing was a tragedy instead of an opportunity. Vanessa's voice, when it came, was small and wounded. She said it was her father's funeral, that she needed a minute to actually feel something. Marcus cut her off immediately, and his next words hit me like a slap. Thank God the old man's finally out of the way. He was the only thing slowing this whole operation down. I stopped breathing entirely. I stood in that dark hallway and listened to my son-in-law describe my husband, the man who had built an organization that fed thousands of children, as an obstacle that had finally been cleared. Marcus kept talking, pacing across the kitchen tile, laying out his plan in the same crisp tone he probably used in old private equity pitch meetings. He told Vanessa they couldn't afford to wait for a formal board vote in 6 weeks like protocol required. He wanted to move now, while grief still had me off balance, while the board was primed with sympathy and looking for reassurance rather than scrutiny. He said grief made people compliant, and that they needed to use my exhaustion before I had time to think clearly. He told her he'd already lined up 3 sympathetic board votes and that he wanted me to sign a durable power of attorney over foundation operations by the end of the week, framed as simply easing my burden during bereavement. Vanessa hesitated. I heard the nervous shift in her voice as she said her mother would never agree to give up control that fast, that I was too sharp, too involved, that pushing this quickly might make me suspicious. I stood in the shadows praying, actually praying, that my daughter would find whatever backbone I knew was still buried somewhere inside her. Instead, Marcus laughed, a short, dismissive sound. He told her it didn't matter whether I agreed willingly. If I hesitated, if I pushed back even slightly, he had already prepared a narrative for the board that the stress of losing Walter had affected my judgment, that a woman my age going through sudden, traumatic grief couldn't reasonably be trusted with an organization moving $8 million a year. He said the board's insurance attorney had already advised him informally that a temporary incapacity clause could be invoked with 2 supporting physician letters he claimed he could easily arrange through a family friend who ran a concierge medical practice. He told Vanessa that once he had operational control locked in, my seat on the board would become symbolic at best, and eventually he'd quietly ease me into what he called emeritus status, a polite way of saying they would push me out entirely. I stood frozen, waiting for my daughter to explode, to defend her father's memory, to defend me. The silence stretched unbearably long, and then I heard her exhale and say, quietly, that she supposed he knew best, that they did need the stability for the kids' sake. She surrendered in under 10 seconds. Something inside me went very still and very cold in that hallway. It wasn't the crushing grief I'd been carrying since 3 in the morning. It was something older and steadier, a version of myself I hadn't needed to summon since the early years of building the foundation, back when we fought skeptical donors and hostile local politicians who thought a couple of nobodies from a farmhouse had no business running anything. Marcus believed he was dealing with a heartbroken widow who would sign whatever was placed in front of her out of sheer exhaustion. He had no idea that Walter and I had spent 4 decades reading people exactly like him, spotting the difference between genuine partnership and quiet predation. I did not walk into that kitchen. I did not confront them or let them know I'd heard every word. I backed away slowly, careful with my steps, and made my way instead toward Walter's study, my grief momentarily eclipsed by something sharper and infinitely more useful, They wanted a quiet, bloodless takeover. They were about to get something else entirely. I closed the study door behind me and turned the old brass lock, sealing myself off from the murmur of the reception still drifting through the house. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I sat down in Walter's leather chair, the one that still faintly smelled like his aftershave, and let myself breathe for the first time in hours. An hour earlier, I had been a woman ready to fold quietly into grief and let her family handle the rest. But what I'd just overheard in that kitchen burned through the fog like acid. I understood now with total clarity that if I confronted them that night, in the middle of a house full of donors and board members, I would simply become the emotional, unstable widow Marcus had already prepared everyone to expect. I had to let him believe his plan was working exactly as intended. Nothing makes a predator more careless than believing his prey is already defeated. I sat at Walter's desk and pulled open the bottom drawer, the one where he kept his most sensitive foundation files locked away from the general office staff, the same one only the two of us had keys to. Behind the ordinary tax documents and grant renewal paperwork, my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a slim accordion folder tucked flat against the back panel that I'd never noticed before. I pulled it free and set it on the desk. Inside were pages of Walter's handwriting, cramped and urgent, nothing like his usual careful engineer's print. He had been keeping notes, dates going back nearly 8 months, well before his stroke, tracking discrepancies in the foundation's discretionary spending account, the very account Marcus had been managing since he took over daily operations. Walter had circled specific transactions in red pen, a consulting retainer paid to a firm that, according to public records Walter had printed and stapled to the page, didn't appear to actually exist beyond a single-page website. A leadership retreat in Aspen billed at $11,000 that no board members besides Marcus had actually attended. I sat back in the chair and let out a long, shaking breath. My husband had known. In the final months of his life, while his own body was quietly failing him, he had been building a case, gathering evidence, trying to protect the organization we'd spent our lives creating from a man he no longer trusted, and he never got the chance to bring it to me. I turned to the next section of the folder, and this part was different. It wasn't financial records. It was a manila subfolder labeled simply with a question mark in Walter's handwriting, and beneath it, printouts of old board meeting minutes going back nearly 6 years, along with something that looked like correspondence between Walter and an old engineering colleague of his who now worked in municipal risk assessment. I touched the edge of that folder and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air outside. Walter was not a man who chased rumors. If he had built a separate investigation into something involving board governance that went back 6 years, it meant he'd found something that genuinely frightened him, something that went far beyond a padded expense account. I opened the folder and began to read the pages Walter had left for me, understanding somehow that he had wanted me to find exactly this, at exactly this moment. The documents told a story that took my breath away in an entirely different way than the embezzlement had. 6 years earlier, before Marcus had officially joined the foundation's staff, he had served on the board of a much smaller regional charity, one that quietly folded amid what the local paper had briefly, almost invisibly, called financial irregularities before the story disappeared entirely. Walter had tracked down the former executive director of that charity, a woman named Priscilla Hodge who had since moved out of state, and the two of them had corresponded for months. In her letters, carefully preserved in Walter's folder, Priscilla described watching Marcus systematically funnel donor funds through inflated vendor contracts into accounts controlled by companies registered to his own relatives, always careful to keep his personal name off any paperwork, always positioning someone else to take the fall if anything was ever noticed. She wrote that by the time she'd gathered enough evidence to go to the board, Marcus had already resigned quietly, citing Tuna, a new opportunity, and the charity's remaining leadership, embarrassed and afraid of scandal, chose to let it die rather than pursue him publicly. Priscilla had tried to warn people. Nobody had listened. And now here he was again, at our foundation, running the exact same playbook, this time with a much bigger organization and a much more trusting family standing in his way. I sat frozen at that desk with the December light fading outside the study window, staring at pages that revealed my son-in-law had done this before, had learned from doing it before, and had specifically chosen an aging couple building a family foundation because we represented precisely the kind of soft, trusting target that let this scheme work. Walter had died knowing this. He had spent his final working months quietly assembling proof instead of confronting Marcus outright because he understood, the way I now understood, that accusations without ironclad evidence would only be spun as the paranoid ramblings of a man losing his grip. He had left me the map. He simply hadn't lived long enough to walk the path himself. I traced my finger over his handwriting on the inside cover of the folder, where he had written a short list in block letters, underlined twice. Call denies Marrow. Forensic audit. Do not tell Marcus. My husband, in the final months of his life, weakened, exhausted, quietly dying, had been assembling a legal strategy to protect everything we'd built from the man our daughter had married. I felt a wave of grief so profound it nearly buckled me in that chair, followed almost immediately by a resolve that steadied my spine in a way nothing else could have. I owed it to Walter to finish exactly what he had started. I owed it to every family whose child had eaten a warm lunch because of the foundation we built to make sure a predator did not walk away wearing the crown. Walter had spent his life building. I recognized the name Denise Marrow immediately. She was a forensic accountant Walter had used years earlier during a routine audit dispute with a corporate sponsor, sharp, discreet, and utterly unimpressed by titles or intimidation. I found her contact information still filed in Walter's old Rolodex, an actual Rolodex, because my husband distrusted anything he couldn't hold in his hands. The reception noise was finally dying down outside the study door as guests began filtering out into the cold evening. I sat in the dark for a long moment, the folder open in front of me, and then I picked up Walter's old desk phone and dialed a number that was going to change everything. I called Denise the following morning, keeping my voice steady, businesslike, giving away nothing beyond a request for a confidential forensic review of our discretionary accounts, framed simply as routine due diligence following a change in leadership. She agreed immediately. And over the following 3 weeks, while Marcus busied himself drafting his leadership transition memo and quietly courting board members over expensive lunches he billed to the foundation, Denise and her small team combed through 6 years of financial records with a precision that would have made Walter proud. I played my part flawlessly during those 3 weeks. I let Marcus believe I was fading, distracted, drowning in grief exactly as he expected. I signed nothing without carefully reading every word twice, and quietly stalling with vague promises to think it over, letting him believe my hesitation was simple widow's fog rather than calculated patience. I attended the emergency board meeting he scheduled and sat quietly while he presented his case for interim executive chairman, nodding along, offering no resistance, watching him grow more confident and more careless with each passing day. 2 weeks in, Denise called me with findings that confirmed everything Walter had suspected and more. The Shell consulting firm was registered to Marcus's cousin. The Aspen retreat had been a personal vacation for Marcus and Vanessa, billed entirely to foundation funds. Over the past 14 months alone, Denise's team traced just over $340,000 in foundation money routed through inflated vendor invoices into accounts that traced back through a chain of shell companies remarkably similar to the ones described in Priscilla Hodge's old letters, to accounts controlled by Marcus himself. It was the same scheme, refined and scaled up, run against an organization that trusted him completely because he'd married into the family. Denise recommended immediately looping in the foundation's outside legal counsel and, given the dollar amounts involved crossing state lines through interstate wire transfers, potentially notifying federal authorities given the nonprofit's tax-exempt status and the mail and wire fraud implications. I scheduled the formal board meeting for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks to the day after Walter's funeral, framed to Marcus simply as the vote to formalize his interim chairmanship, exactly the meeting he had been maneuvering toward since the moment my husband died. I asked our longtime foundation attorney, a sharp, quietly formidable woman named Denise's colleague, Judge Arthur Whitfield, retired now but still trusted by every board member in that room, to attend. I did not tell Marcus why. I simply told him I wanted a familiar face present given the significance of the transition, and he, so confident in his own victory, didn't question it for a second. The boardroom on that Tuesday morning was the same one where Walter and I had presented our very first annual report 20 years earlier. Back when we were terrified nobody would take 2 school teachers turned philanthropists seriously. Marcus arrived early, sharply dressed, shaking hands with board members, working the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Vanessa sat beside him, quiet, pale, unable to meet my eyes. My grandchildren, thankfully, were with a sitter, spared from what was about to happen. I sat at the head of the table where Walter used to sit, and I let Marcus open the meeting exactly as he'd planned, thanking the board for their patience during this difficult transition period, outlining his vision for scaling the foundation's impact, gesturing toward a slideshow full of the kind of buzzwords that had never once fed a hungry child. When he finished, I simply nodded and thanked him. And then I said that before the board voted on any leadership transition, I had asked our forensic accountant to present a routine financial review, standard practice. I explained calmly, whenever an organization changes hands. I watched something flicker behind Marcus's eyes, the first crack in his composure, but he still believed he had nothing to fear. Denise Merrow walked into that boardroom carrying a slim black folder, and for the next 20 minutes, in a calm, unhurried voice, she read the entire scheme into the record. The Shell consulting firm, the Aspen vacation, the $340,000 in trace transfers. She read the routing numbers aloud. She named the accounts. And then, because I had asked her specifically to include it, she read a summary of what her team had uncovered about a small regional charity 6 years earlier and a woman named Priscilla Hodge who had tried to warn people and been ignored. The color drained entirely from Marcus's face. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Around that table, board members who had known Walter for 20 years sat in absolute silence, watching the man they'd been about to hand an $8 million organization to unravel in real time. Marcus tried to speak, tried to explain the consulting fees as legitimate strategic work, but Judge Whitfield, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, simply asked him to produce a single deliverable, a single document, a single email thread showing actual work performed by this consulting firm. Marcus had nothing. The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. I stood then, for the first time since the meeting began, and I looked directly at my son-in-law. I told him that 3 weeks ago, in my own kitchen, at my own husband's funeral reception, I had heard him call my husband an obstacle finally out of the way. I told him I had heard every word of his plan to have me declared incompetent, to push me quietly into what he'd called emeritus status. I told him that my husband had spent the final months of his life, weakened and dying, building the very case that had just been read into this record, because he loved this foundation and this family too much to let it be stolen out from under us. The room was utterly silent. Marcus's mouth opened and closed twice with nothing coming out. Judge Whitfield informed him, in the calm, measured tone of a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms, that given the amounts involved and the interstate nature of the transfers, the board had a legal obligation to refer the findings to both law enforcement and the State Attorney General's Charities Bureau, and that federal authorities would very likely become involved, given the wire fraud implications and the foundation's tax-exempt status. He informed Marcus that his access to all foundation accounts, systems, and physical offices was terminated effective immediately, and that Foundation Counsel would be in contact regarding restitution. Marcus's own attorney, a young associate he had brought along, expecting a celebratory formality rather than an ambush, quietly gathered his briefcase and informed Marcus, in the hallway outside where I could still hear every word, that given what he had just witnessed, his firm would not be representing him going forward, effective immediately. Marcus stood in that hallway, stripped of his title before he'd even officially received it, stripped of his lawyer, stripped of the confident swagger he'd worn like armor since the day Walter died. He turned to Vanessa, reaching for her hand, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my daughter pulled her hand away from his. She stood very still, looking at the man she'd married, and something in her face told me she was finally, painfully, seeing him clearly for the first time in a decade. She did not go with him when he left the building that afternoon. Over the following months, the State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation, and given the scale of the fraud and its interstate wire component, federal prosecutors eventually filed charges as well. Marcus lost his home, his accounts frozen pending the investigation, and every professional relationship he had cultivated so carefully evaporated the moment his name appeared in the local paper attached to the words charity fraud. Vanessa filed for divorce within a month, moved back into the farmhouse with Sophie and Miles while she rebuilt her footing, and slowly, painfully, began to reclaim pieces of herself I hadn't seen since before she married him. She started attending board meetings again, this time asking sharp, careful questions instead of sitting silently at Marcus's side. She told me one evening, sitting at the same kitchen table where Marcus had once denied her father comfort care, That losing everything Marcus had promised her was the only thing that had finally let her see what she'd actually lost long before that, which was herself. The foundation itself transitioned smoothly under an interim board chair, one of Walter's oldest friends and a founding board member, while a proper search began for permanent leadership. This time, with governance safeguards, Judge Whitfield helped us build specifically to prevent any single person from ever again consolidating that much unchecked control. Every dollar Denise's team traced was eventually recovered through the restitution order, and the board voted unanimously to name the newly renovated Community Learning Center the one funding rural literacy programs across 3 states. After Walter, a small, permanent piece of him woven into the work he'd given his whole life to. The months passed slowly, the way grief does when you finally let yourself actually feel it instead of holding it at bay to survive a crisis. The sharp edges softened. The farmhouse, which had felt like a stranger's house during those terrible weeks after Walter died, slowly began to feel like our home again, filled now with the noise of my grandchildren doing homework at the same kitchen table where Walter used to review grant applications. On a quiet evening, exactly 1 year after he passed, I walked out onto the back porch he had built with his own hands decades earlier, holding a cup of coffee the way we used to share every morning before the sun came up. I sat down in the old rocking chair, listened to the wind moving through the oak trees at the edge of the property, and spoke out loud to my husband the way I still do most evenings. I told him the foundation was safe. I told him I had finished exactly what he started. I told him he could finally rest. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this is that family isn't something you're owed loyalty from simply because of the name on a marriage license or a birth certificate. For years, I stayed quiet while Marcus disrespected everything Walter and I had built, because I believed that keeping the peace was my duty as a mother and a grandmother, because I told myself that time and patience would eventually soften him into someone worthy of our trust. But silence in the face of quiet manipulation was never peace. It was simply surrender dressed up in politeness. When you let people cross your boundaries again and again without consequence, you are not teaching them to respect you. You are teaching them exactly how far they can push. If you are ever fortunate enough to build something that matters, something that outlives you, you have to be willing to protect it fiercely, even from the people closest to you, even when it breaks your heart to do it. Real love does not require you to hand over everything you've built simply to keep the peace. And real family does not use your grief as a weapon against you. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share where you're watching from in the comments below. I read every single one.